Hello, hi, I'm Lucy Bullivant. Welcome to Bedtime Stories. Um, I am here because I've agreed to give a bedtime story reading. I'm a place strategist, curatorial director, founder of urbanista.org, my webzine for livable urbanism, and the co-founder of Urban Manifesto together with Prathama Manohar, who is an urbanist. Of the Urban Manifesto new webinar series, we've been working live streaming today, which is live streamed every Tuesday at 4:30 BST. And it's also part of the Architecture Foundation's 100-day studio. I'm also an author currently grappling with the challenge of writing the second edition of my book, Master Planning Futures, which won Book of the Year at the Urban Design Group Awards. Originally published in 2012 after the shockwaves of the global economic crisis, the new edition is coming together slowly, page by page during the pandemic. And as we transition into a new era on so many fronts. I've chosen to read from a work published a year after my book came out in 2013, written by a really exceptional author, journalist and social justice activist, Laura Gottesdiener. And it's called A Dream Foreclosed, Black America and the Fight for a Place to Call Home. Here's the cover. It's a really beautifully crafted story about what is it about? It's about predatory lending, about foreclosure abuse as part of a historic pattern of disenfranchisement, the racial politics of home ownership, and the brave struggles of African American communities to keep their homes and their dignities. The search for home being a centuries-long journey for people of African descent in the United States, and a universal need for all of us. So Laura's remarkable testimony is recounted with great historical depth, and as Noam Chomsky, I think, said, historical depth and also very acute analysis politically. And I was really impressed by the way in which she integrates this side of her work as a cultural historian with her very brilliant narration of the powerful story of 4 different families living in different parts of the US, and their dreams and their aspirations. The heart-rending accounts of being thrown out of their modest homes, but also the inspiring and the brave work of the home liberation activists. And in the reading, you'll find out a little bit more about what that entails if you are not so far aware. And reinforced by the Occupy movement, which of course was very active at that time. So from the very outset, the housing crisis was one of the very main grievances of the Occupy movement and the reclamation of land. And that was a really core strategy of the protest. So Laura charts the family's stories from the 1990s when they search for new homes. Then she takes the book. I mean, it's quite a small book, but my God, it packs a punch. There's so much in it, and so we transition through into the noughties, where they find themselves in their homes under attack, threatened by bankers, politicians, and a society in crisis. And finally, in there we see them and we experience them and empathise with them in their fight back. Some of the gains made include community land trusts, and this aspect of it really resonated with me because I've written about community land trusts in the UK in urbanista.org, where you can find a a long account, a long essay in the current issue of urbanista.org, and also in my Recoded City book that I co-authored with Thomas Macora, in a chapter which is about a very famous CLT called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Dudley in Boston, which was the very first group in the US to win the power of eminent domain to acquire land for local residents for their resident-led, purely resident-led development activities in 1988. So as Laura says in her introduction, these individuals are doing what most people throughout history have always done when their most sacred dreams are threatened by civil injustice and by evil. They fight back. And I'm reading tonight a story about the fight back towards the end of the book, and it's called Liberated, which is about Martha Biggs and Jaduana Walker, who live on the south side of Chicago in Illinois. So let me just drink a glass of water. And if you're sitting comfortably, then I will begin. Her mother was here. Jaduana rushed to meet Martha, who'd come to visit her eldest daughter. It was the 17th of June 2011, and Jaduana had just graduated middle school. She'd been living with her father since the threat of intervention by the Department of Children and Social Services forced Martha to split the kids up. But today her mother was here, and she came with a surprise. "We got a home," Jaduana remembers Martha telling her. The information didn't immediately register. "What? We got a home?" Jaduana asked. "Yeah, we got a home," Martha repeated in her typical straightforward manner. "You want to come and see it?" There was indeed a house, a 101-year-old two-family home built with red bricks. It had a front porch, a backyard, and a pretty second-floor balcony supported by pillars and ringed by a short, wrought island railing. It looked a lot like the neighbouring houses on South Prairie Avenue, about a block from where Interstate 90 cuts diagonally through the south side of Chicago. Inside, the house was clean and simple, with newly polished hardwood floors and freshly painted caramel-coloured walls. The house hadn't always looked this way. When Martha first visited it the day after Patricia Hill handed her the keys, it was a typical vacant house in the neighbourhood. Deutsche Bank claimed to own it and had foreclosed on the owner, Patricia's daughter, Stacy, in 2009. The bank, however, had failed to assume ownership because its own law firm reported that the foreclosure documents had been altered or fabricated. In the spring of 2011, while Martha was sleeping in a car, the court halted Hill's foreclosure proceeding, as well as nearly 2,000 others. As the house sat vacant, strippers tore out the toilet, the copper wiring, the pipes, the radiator, the ceiling fans, and almost everything in the kitchen, including some cabinet doors. When Martha first entered, there were holes in the walls and trash on the floor. Still, it hadn't been taken over by a gang, and it hadn't been set on fire, and it hadn't been flooded. It was salvageable. Martha parked her white minivan in front of the house and began to work. But what was more astonishing was that was the scene outside the house in the front yard. As Jaduana watched, people carrying signs and reporters shouldering heavy news cameras descended on the front lawn. Channel 4 arrived, Channel 7, Fox, even a reporter from the New York Times. The grass was covered with posters reading, "Reclaimed by the community" and "Stop foreclosure." Members of the Chicago anti-eviction campaign arrived clad in the in the group's black T-shirts. Reporters set up a podium of microphones. The Biggs family had lived in plenty of foreclosed houses over the last decade, but this was something different. This was not just a house, it was a stage. The crowd began shouting, fight, 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 because housing is a human right. Justice, Jimia, and Davion took up the chant with their sing-song voices as they played tag on the front porch. Suddenly all eyes were on Martha and her children. "Martha, Martha, Martha," the crowd chanted as they stepped up to the microphone. After years of silence and invisibility, the Biggs women finally had their audience. "Hello, my name is Martha Biggs, and I'm from Cabrini Green," Martha began. She clutched Justice's head to her waist, and her daughter shyly buried her face in Martha's side. Jaduana and Jimia stood behind their mother's right shoulder. Jaduana was almost as tall as Martha, and with her hair swept back and her face set, she looked older than her 15 years. "I've been here since I was like 2 years old," continued Martha. "I was evicted, homeless, on the street, nowhere to go, got a job, worked hard to support my kids, was homeless again because the building I moved into was in foreclosure. So therefore me and my family had to take another journey, to be homeless again, to sleep in our cars, to go to different units, different family members' houses, to run around, no place to go." The crowd was silent except for the snapping of the reporters' cameras. "We came up with a conclusion not to give up, always fight, never sit down, keep it moving, keep it working. This is what happens when you never sit down. This is what you accomplish. Stuff like this here," Martha continued. "It's for the future of my kids. They ain't got to worry about where they're going to sleep, where they're going to go to wash up at, and where their next pair of shoes or socks are going to get cleaned at. They ain't going to worry about that anymore. They ain't got to worry about any of those things because I never gave up and I never stopped trying," she said. Then, surrounded by her kids and captured on television, Martha declared the House liberated. The idea of home liberation is simple. Currently, there are millions of vacant bank-owned houses across the country, dragging down property values, bankrupting cities, fueling crime, and creating an almost irreconcilable rupture in the theory of supply and demand. In well-off suburban areas, these vacant houses are symbols of the United States' seemingly limitless ability to produce excess. In poorer areas like the south side of Chicago, they symbolize a darker characteristic of America's capitalist business culture, the ability to allow those with staggering excess to coexist alongside and prey on those in desperate need. As the houses sit vacant, there are millions of Americans like the Biggses who have nowhere to live and fight through life each day as capitalism's refugees. Some were evicted from their homes through foreclosure. Others didn't even have the luxury of owning a detached house to begin with. What they share is a desire to survive through conditions so difficult that getting through each day should be celebrated as a triumph of will. But unlike the vacant houses, these people are not symbols. They are our neighbours, friends, family members and classmates. And they have had enough of living as refugees or perhaps exiles in their own country simply because they can't afford the price of a place to call home. Martha's was the first publicised home liberation in Chicago and one of the first in the country since the economic collapse began. Nearly everyone from the land reclamation movement was there. It was an emotional day for organisers who rarely saw home liberations actually happen, especially in such a public manner. Rob Robinson of the New York City chapter of a group called Take Back the Land remembers watching Justice run out of the house with a piece of plywood on which she'd scrawled in her 8-year-old handwriting, "Thank you, everyone." I just started to tear up, Robinson recalls. JR was talking to me and I was like, "Not now, JR, I need a minute." For Martha's children, the day was something that they'd only dreamed of. I never thought we'd be here, said Joanna. Home liberation as a political movement has existed in the United States since as early as the late 1960s in New York City. Groups like the Young Lords and Harlem Fight Back began organising building takeovers both as a strategy to solve growing homelessness and as a protest against the city's practice of intentionally keeping thousands of apartment buildings vacant until housing prices rose. The movement's days of coordinated takeovers are legendary. In 1979, teams of people reclaimed 30 buildings for immediate use in Harlem, East New York, and Newark, New Jersey, all in the same weekend. In the 1980s, people liberated from another 30 apartment buildings across the Lower East Side and as many vacant lots, which they then turned into community gardens. The city waged pitched battles over the occupied buildings. Frank Morales, a priest involved in home liberation in the Lower East Side, remembers how hundreds of riot cops wielding automatic rifles used to surround the buildings which Morales and his comrades barricaded shut. One night they brought a wrecking ball at midnight into one of the houses I was living in, he recalls. I lived on the top floor. It was a sixth floor tenement, and they knocked the front wall down, so my room was exposed. I just looked at this wrecking ball swinging towards me. I managed to run out with 2 bags of my belongings. After more than a decade of struggle, the city finally handed over titles to several of the buildings which remain occupied today. The movement resurged in October 2006 when a group called Take Back the Land seized a vacant public lot in Miami and created an encampment called the Umoja Village, which housed more than 50 people for 6 months. An African-American-led group, Take Back the Land, argues that the relationship to land lies at the root of racial and economic inequalities in the United States. The group envisions a new system in which land use is controlled by the community and housing is enshrined as a human right. As the foreclosure crisis worsened, Take Back the Land grew into a national network that works with displaced families to liberate bank-owned houses such as Martha Biggs. Since 2006, Take Back the Land and other housing groups have helped communities take over a dozen vacant bank-owned homes in Miami, Madison, Rochester, Detroit, New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, and other cities. The ever-growing need for shelter fuels the movement. But there is also a moral question, grounded in human rights, evoked by the coexistence of millions of empty bank-owned homes and millions of families who need a place to live. Maybe homes, these groups reason, shouldn't be considered commodities at all. We are in a transformative moment, said Max Ramo, one of the leaders of Take Back the Land. I think we're going to have significant changes in the way people think, not just about housing, but about land itself. Ramo and others have turned the ongoing foreclosure crisis into a window of opportunity to challenge the current conception of individualistic, profit-fueled land ownership. The group is creating the community land trusts, which allow neighbourhoods to make decisions about how homes and land are used. Their goal is to liberate thousands of properties from bank control and to place those properties in community land trusts that would protect them from being used as commodities. Ultimately, the move is to take homes off the market. The move to take homes off the market is not just a housing movement. It's also a push to decommodify society, to begin to articulate a world in which monetary transactions no longer control the value and identity of human lives. In the years since Martha's home liberation, she has grown into one of the most prominent housing organisers in the country. She often speaks at conferences in New York City, Miami and New Orleans, and helps JR lead the anti-eviction campaign meetings. Most significantly, home liberations are sweeping Chicago, and many people give Martha credit for catalysing the movement. Martha kicked this all off, said John Newman, who now works full-time to liberate and repair homes across the south side of Chicago. Multiple autonomous groups, including Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign, Take Back the Land and the Occupy Homes Chicago, compete to see which can liberate more homes from bank control. Like Martha, the majority of organisers are themselves, currently or formerly, people who without a stable place to live. It's decidedly a low-budget affair. For a while, one man pawned his own belongings to buy locks and construction supplies to rehabilitate homes for other people. The priority is to house families, particularly single women with children who often do the majority of the clean-up work themselves. Erica Johnson, for example, moved into a liberated home on the far south side with help from members of Occupy Homes Chicago. The first day she and her kids visited the house, it was filled with garbage and drug paraphernalia. It lacked electricity and indoor plumbing. The front yard was overrun with waist-high weeds. But when her ride came to take the family back to the shelter where they lived, the family where they lived, Johnson's 15-year-old daughter said they should stay and live there while they fixed it up. So the next day, Johnson began whacking the weeds with a big knife. Within a few weeks, the inside of the house was clean, and Johnson was working with her neighbour to fix the plumbing. In this sense, what Martha, JR and the rest are building is not a social service agency that shelters families. She and others are creating a new economic structure in which the rules are simple: meet people's basic needs and employ everyone. Martha's favourite case study is her friend Thomas Turner. When he first started working with Martha and Occupy Chicago, he had no place to live, and he was more than a little mentally unstable. He sometimes relapsed into the drug addiction that had kept him cycling in and out of prison for years. Finally, nobody wanted Turner around. He embodied the failures of Chicago, where the current system keeps nearly 20% of the residents in minority neighbourhoods out of work, and brands more than half of African Americans felons for life. But did you ever think Thomas was crazy because he didn't have a place to go? Asked Martha. That's when you go home at night, sit down at your table eating dinner. He doesn't have a table or a dinner. That he's outside, and that he might drive a man crazy. In the spring of 2012, Turner took over a bank-owned house and began fixing it up. Everything changed. He stood straighter and he stopped using drugs. He took another house and then a third and then a fourth, fixing them up for others. When a local property owner saw what he was doing, she donated 3 more. Lawyers reached out to him, and soon Turner founded his own non-profit. He appointed a board of directors and began doing radio interviews. "This is about making our own economic system," he said, as he showed me round one of the homes he'd renovated. The walls were freshly painted and decorated with intricate stenciling of birds. In another room, a young couple that Turner was mentoring moved buckets of paint and mop water. The two were hardly in their 20s and neither had a stable home. So Turner was teaching them how to secure and renovate foreclosed houses. with the hope that they'd take one for themselves soon. I'm trying to build a system where homeless people have jobs where we can employ them, said Turner. I don't have all the answers, but I do know that housing is a human right. The idea that all people have the right to a safe and a decent place to live is one that, for an increasing number of Americans, overrides issues of profit margins, interest rates, or even property contracts. But it's a vision that Martha has harboured for decades, ever since her own overcrowded youth in Cabrini Green. But no matter how rapidly this movement grows in Chicago, Martha never forgets to focus on her and her children's own home. One sweltering summer afternoon, she and her kids gathered in the living room, turned on the Nintendo Wii, and did what families should only do behind closed doors, competitively danced to Michael Jackson. Go Justice, Martha yelled as the 9-year-old competed against John Newman, another housing activist who had been living with the family. Thriller blared from the television. Beads of sweat dropped off Newman's foreheads. He was a smoother dancer than Justice, but the girl was bolder. 2 other activists arrived. There was work to be done, but the 4 had plans because the 4 had plans to go clean up a foreclosed house. But for a few moments, Martha decided to enjoy what she had been searching for in her quest for home over the last decade: family time. Justice flung her body through the stomping pivots, but she was no match for Newman. So Martha challenged her friend, thinking to avenge her daughter's defeat. The song began, and Martha fixed her eyes on the screen and whispered the words as she danced. Who gave you the right to shake my family, and who gave you the right to shake my baby? She needs me, she said. Martha kept her body high while Newman reached down, stuck out his tongue and smiled so hard the corner of his eyes crinkled. He had far more points than she did, but Martha kept threatening that she was getting her second wind. Both had sweat pouring down their necks. It was the hottest day of the summer's worst heat wave. Davian ran into the room and rolled his weight onto his tippy toes. Yes, I can do that. And onto his tippy toes, and where are we going? Gave a quick shoulder shimmy and ran out. Justice sat on Jimmy's lap and waved her arms in time to the music. Newman won again. He was unstoppable. Martha pulled up her t-shirt and leaned over the box fan to cool off. Joanna stepped into the centre of the living room, gave her mother a high five, and goaded Newman into one last dance. He was exhausted, but he agreed. Like her mother, Joanna executed the moves mechanically. Newman was probably a better dancer, but he was so tired that Joanna won. The girl jumped up and down in celebration. I'm going to help you pick your face up off the floor, she cried. It was her favourite phrase that summer, and everyone in the room laughed. When the teams finally left the house to work, still covered in sweat, Newman remarked, "We're taking over home so you can do just that." Martha Bigg's new home isn't perfect. Her kids, especially Jimmy, are still worried that they might be evicted. Martha is already making preparations just in case they have to move. Nothing is ever permanent, especially in activism, but ultimately the success of a home liberation, and of all social movements really, is creating a new chapter to a story that everyone said was outside your control. Thank you for listening. I was reading Laura Gottesdiener's A Dream Foreclosed, Black America and the Fight for a Place to Call Home. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoyed listening to my excerpt from this amazing book, and I wish you a very good night. Thank you.